everyone, welcome to our press briefing. The time to implement the phase-out is now. How COP30 can finally put the end of fossil fuels on track. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Rachel Brabbins from 350.org, and we have three fantastic speakers for you today. But before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. Each of our panelists will speak for between 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions. We're also live streaming the briefing, so we'll be monitoring questions from those of you who are watching online. Please let us know your name and your outlet when you ask your questions. Any questions that we don't get to, we will endeavour to answer after the briefing. So without further ado, let's make a start. COP30 has the opportunity to mark a major turning point, the moment the world finally agrees on a clear, coordinated plan to phase out fossil fuels. In our briefing today, you'll hear about progress on climate finance and the launch of the Belém Action Mechanism, or BAM, and how they are key to enabling a just energy transition. We'll also look at Brazil's leadership as COP30 Presidency and what's expected from high-emitting countries as momentum builds here in Belém. I'll hand over to our panelists now to introduce themselves, Andreas, Nafi and Amiera.
Good morning. I'm Andreas Sieber, the Associate Director of Policy Campaigns at 350.org.
My name is Nafi Quarshie, Africa Director for the Natural Resource Governance Institute, and based in Accra.
My name is Amiera Sawas. I'm Head of Research and Policy at the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and I'm also the co-coordinator of the Climate Action Network Just Transition Working Group.
Well, good morning. We have both a real opportunity and a fight at our hands to deliver a Mutirão Pact in Belém, and as President Lula said, to move away from fossil fuels. This Monday, the latest NDC synthesis report came out and told us that the current climate plans of countries will only deliver emission cuts by about 12% by 2035. We need to quintuple these reductions by then to keep global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So COP must respond to this glaring shortfall, and President Lula promised us to deliver roadmaps on halting deforestation and transitioning away from fossil fuels. So now we must see the progress here at COP30. A pact is a critical step towards that. I'll go into the details of that in a minute, but I shall also say finance and just transition progress is crucial, and my colleagues will speak to this one. So COP started fairly smoothly without an agenda fight, thanks to skillful bridging by the presidency, but we believe we might have our first fight on us later today in the Stocktake plenary. This builds on the presidency consultations, and we should both look at procedure and process here. So how will the 4 items that are actually negotiated in these consultations, finance, transparency report, responding to the NDC synthesis report, and public finance, how will they come together and go forward? There's an overwhelming majority of countries who want this process to go forward and deliver. Not necessarily in a common decision by name or by precise process, but in some kind of equivalent, some Mutirão Pact, if you like. And today's plenary will be the first pivotal moment where we will see that probably coming to the floor, where we'll hear from countries, and it is time for parties to also then put forward those calls and for the presidency to listen. We really saw that there's a chance to deliver a roadmap on fossil fuels, to transition away from fossil fuels. We heard it from various countries. We also heard a vast majority of countries demand that there is some kind of collective decision being made here. By my counting, over 120 countries in the past 2 days have spoken up proactively on that, either individually or via their negotiation groups. So this is really the time for Brazil to demonstrate leadership, to work with the vast majority of countries to enable something productive coming out of here, enable a cross-cutting decision coming out of these consultations, and the Mutirão Pact and the roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels. Thanks.
Thank you. Africa comes to the COP30 not to make excuses, but to make a case for fairness. The science is clear. Fossil fuels must be phased out. Africa understands this perhaps better than any other region in the world. But what the COP30 and the world must do also is to understand that Africa cannot phase out when it has not yet phased in. Across our continent, over 600 million Africans still live without electricity. Another 900 million lack access to clean cooking. Yet, our countries are being asked to abandon the fossil fuel that currently provide up to 40% of government revenues in some economies without credible, accessible, or predictable financial support to replace them. That's not transition, that's economic cliff. So when we speak of just transition, Africa insists that it must mean finance, fairness, and flexibility. Finance is adequate and accessible. Fairness that recognizes different starting points, and flexibility that allows countries to sequence reforms while still growing and protecting their people. Let's be honest, the COP30 process has not delivered on its financial promises to Africa. We've seen pledges made and broken. Africa needs about 400 billion per year in climate finance and only receive 47 billion. Meanwhile, Africa is paying interest of about 163 billion to creditors. Africa is not asking for charity. We expect climate finance obligation to be met. When we talk about phasing out, we must also talk about financing in. So what do we need COP30 to deliver? 3 things: clarity, credibility, and commitment. First, clarity. We need a concrete, time-bound roadmap for phasing out fossil fuels that reflects different realities. Africa's pathway cannot mirror Europe's or America's. The transition in Africa must prioritize energy access, job creation, diversification, and development, not just emission reduction targets. Second, credibility. We need real finance on the table, not recycled pledges, not loans that worsen the debt crisis. We need grant-based and concessional funding for clean energy, for economic diversification, for social protection, complemented by debt relief and reform. That means scaling up existing financing facilities for both adaptation and mitigation, and reforming international finance institutions as they serve, not suffocate developing economies. Third, commitment. We need a global deal that treats Africa as a partner, not a casualty. Partnership that unlocks responsible private capital, technology, and skills transfer, but are built on transparency, accountability, and country ownership. Africa calls COP30 to turn the Baku to Belém roadmap into real action and deliver on past promises, and align funding with our climate and development needs. Africa is ready to move, but we must not move with rhetoric. We need resources. Let's be clear, the question is not whether Africa will phase out fossil fuel. The question is whether the COP30 and the world will invest in an Africa transition that is just and achievable. Without that investment, the phase out agenda will fall not just for Africa, will fail not just for Africa, but for everyone. For avoidance of that, a world that can find about 6.6 trillion for defense, warfare, and ammunition can't surely find 1.3 trillion to secure humanity's future. If COP30 is to make history, it must not pretend that ambitions can be substituted for finance. We cannot transition on promises. What Africa demands and deserves is a funded, fair, and inclusive transition that leaves no country behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So President Lula has said that this COP should be the COP of truth, and truth without action and accountability is only going to emphasize the division between the global north and the global south in terms of their actual ability to make the transition away from fossil fuels, mitigate climate change, and adapt to the worst consequences of it. So we really need to move forward with a spirit of implementation, not just putting issues on the table, but actually demonstrating that parties are willing to act on those issues. As my colleagues have really eloquently outlined, what we actually need here for a just outcome is a package that requires implementation and structures that will enable that implementation. After a decade of basically drift and false solutions, we're seeing a lot of false solutions out there outside of the UNFCCC space, which are basically big projects and programs that don't have justice at their heart. So, as a collective of organisations, what we're demanding at this COP is finance, adaptation, and accountability. And some of us, many of us across the coalitions, really believe that a decent, actionable outcome on the Just Transition Work Package is a litmus test, actually, for a successful COP here. What we're calling for is the Climate Action Network, and across all of the observer constituencies we've been working together throughout the year, is for the creation of a new mechanism under the Just Transition Work Package called the Belém Action Mechanism. And this would actually bring together and unite the fragmented efforts in just transition that exist all over the world. Many of them are set up bilaterally, many of them are set up by non-state actors with little accountability, and many of them are actually creating debt and exacerbating the debt crisis, which is exactly part of the problem that my colleague has just spoken to on the African continent. That the escalation of debt is preventing countries from actually taking steps forward on transitioning towards, away from fossil fuels, towards renewable energy, or even accessing finance for adapting to the crisis that's affecting them that they haven't created, right? Loss and damage. So we believe that this mechanism should have 3 elements to it that parties should agree to. The first element is about oversight and coordination. So we need to understand and see collectively what's actually being done on just transition. Because as a movement, we've looked at it, that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of initiatives on just transition that exist at multiple scales and levels. Many of them are doing great work, but many of them are escalating the inequalities and the injustices that exist already. So what we need to do is look at them together and evaluate them against key principles of justice, equity, inclusion, and actually sustainability on making the transition happen, reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement, and ensuring inclusion of all stakeholders who are affected by not only the climate crisis, but the need to transition away from fossil fuels. So we need that coordination and oversight, we need to understand. We then also need to support countries to actually plan and enact strategies on just transition. And since there are so many practitioners globally and countries who are already doing work, why can't we bring them together and bring together that knowledge and expertise to help countries? And so we're saying that a second part of the Belém Action Mechanism should be a knowledge and support arm that can facilitate countries. And the final piece is when countries need support and they can't access the support they need, they can go to the Belém Action Mechanism and say, there's this thing we want to do in our context, which will help our transition. What do you have already? Or what principles do you have? What practices exist? Which stakeholders should we be connecting to? So the third element is more, rather than just an exchange of knowledge on best practice, this is like an active support mechanism or a help desk, you can say. So yesterday in the first contact group, the first kind of negotiations over the Just Transition Work Programme, we actually saw a really exciting set of interventions led by the G77 plus China, who put forward this idea that civil society and the constituencies have been working on all year. They said, look, we think there should be a just transition mechanism and it should include these 3 functions. And there was this snowball effect across many of the developing country blocks, which was super exciting because we haven't seen that kind of unity in quite a while. So clearly just transition is a unifying concept, right, for different parties, because it matters to everyone in every country in the world that their constituencies feel that they're part of the transition and want to act on it so that we can actually make it happen. But unfortunately, we also saw the usual stalling tactics of some blocs in the global north, particularly the European Union, the UK, Canada, Australia. They are very resistant to new forms of institutional mechanism, but when they articulated why, they couldn't tell us what was wrong with the proposal. In fact, they actually articulated in their responses that all of those elements of the proposal are what are necessary and needed. They just resisted the notion of new institutional mechanisms. So we know that actually there is unity in the ideas about what needs to move forward, but where there is a lack is in accountability. So blocs in the global north don't want to take responsibility for their fair share of action that inevitably they will have to do if we're going to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the Just Transition Work Programme is an excellent place to start, because just transitions need to be financed. There needs to be finance flowing from north to south, and countries cannot do this on their own. They can't do it unless we support them in that way. So that's why the resistance is there, but I believe we can have a breakthrough if we have cross-movement solidarity, as we do at the moment, pushing forward and supporting parties from the global south to hold strong on this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Here we go. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for all of your comments. Super interesting. We've already got some questions in from those of you who are watching online. I'll start off with Kate at Argus Media. How many countries are supporting the creation of a fossil fuel phase-out roadmap so far? And who are they? We have Brazil and Colombia. Are there any others? Who would like to take that question?
Right, so there's a number of countries which we know. So the question already named two. OSIS has spoken out in favor of that, of course. The Alliance of Small Island States that I'm counting 44. The EIG has been very vocal across negotiations. That's another 6. I understand it's a bit more complex with regards to the European Union as they internally are just trying to get their shit together. But there's a number of countries we would expect to step forward, right? So that's Denmark, Spain. There's a number of other champions we would expect, and frankly, right, as the wealthy country bloc, they're really the ones who must not step back on this, right? But that's maybe not the full 27 for now, but that's another good chunk you can add to that. Brazil, Colombia, another 2. I understand that there's some further countries in South America. Not all the countries have yet openly stepped forward there, but I think you could count on really a good number of countries. Just one word, because I think that the implicit question in this is, can you actually get this through the COP, right? With some countries, it might be highly critical of this, and I think this is when we need to look very careful at could there be some kind of declaration we expect with some folks who move further and first, and secondly, how could you accommodate these concerns? And I think finance and equity is key there. Another one is to actually make it country-driven, and it's for all. And then that way we think there is actually both critical mass as well as a procedural way forward.
Thanks, Andreas. Would anybody in the room like to ask a question? Please feel free to come in and use your microphone. Just tell us your name and where you're from.
My name is Soumya Sarkar. I'm from India. My question is for Amiera. We are talking about just transition all the time, and in India, I have a specific question about coal, because there is a lot of pressure on India to phase out coal. From my travels in the coal belt of our country, there are about 1 million people directly employed by the coal mining industry. If you look at coal industry as a whole, for everyone involved in mining it, there will be 3 people in support services and allied industries. So, we are talking about 4 million people and 4 million families. If you have 4 to a family, we are talking about, a large number of millions of people. Now, it's all right to talk about, phasing out coal, shutting down coal mines. Where are these people going to go? How India can finance it? The Indian government has said that we can't finance. So.
Thank you, great question. Well, what I would say is one of the key constituencies we're working with is trade unions and workers, right? And also many of our constituencies represent those in precarious work, so those who don't have formal contracts but might be working in the mining and allied industries, as you say. So look, the research is clear globally that people don't have a preference for working in mining or fossil fuels. They want a decent work, they want their rights, they want the right to a sustainable future, and they don't want to have to choose between a decent job and a safe climate, because they're experiencing environmental impacts from those industries as well that are affecting their health. There's been a number of reports which have come out recently, in fact just today a report from Amnesty International that looks at the impact of fossil fuel projects on human rights, and it includes health. So the question is, why aren't governments starting to develop the plans that will enable their constituents to move away into other industries, to have their labour rights, to have a sustainable future? It's incumbent upon governments to look into the future and to take those steps. The world is shifting, so this is the issue that we're facing, is that the global north is moving away from fossil fuels in its own, not all of them, of course there are some countries that are absolutely supercharging them, but what they're also doing at the same time is investing in renewable energies, moving their systems away so that their populations are going to be safe for the future, while the populations of the global south will not. So what we need to do is set the conditions where countries in the global south can actually make those plans that are transitions. So we're not expecting them to do it immediately. We're expecting them to work with their constituencies and develop equity-based, just plans so that they don't feel the shocks and stresses when the actual, transition is more significantly underway. And India has a great opportunity to do that, given the fact that it does have such a large industry. It could be a leader in demonstrating how you do those just transitions equitably. So part of the reason for this Belém Action Mechanism is not to put pressure like you have to do this now, but it's to acknowledge that there's a global injustice in how the transition is happening. There needs to be international cooperation on how we do that moving forward. And those who have the most responsibility, particularly countries in the global north who've created this crisis, have to take action now on financing, technical support, and basically the means of implementation, so that the people who are most marginalised in our global system actually have an opportunity to benefit from the transition and not be left dealing with the worst consequences of it. Thank you.
Can
Thank
I
you,
have
Amiera.
a
Thank
quick
you for that
follow-up
question.
question? Very quick, short. India has a plan, but the main coal extracting company in India is a state-owned company, Coal India, you know that. Coal India has barely, 300,000, 400,000 people formally employed. Okay, rest are contract labor. They have a plan for, part of that 4,000, 100,000 people. What about the other millions,
Just to say, that's the point, that's the purpose of cross-movement work, right? That's the purpose of the trade union movement, it's the purpose of the feminist movement and others, because we're the ones who are connecting, and we have hundreds of partners in India who are on the ground connecting with those people. That's why we're making the case for this, because there needs to be oversight on what's happening, and there needs to be support for reaching those people that you're talking about.
Thank you so much. Now a question for Nafi, a couple in from Climate Home News actually. So Chloe Ferrand and also Vivian Chai, they both want to know about the African position on the roadmap to phase out fossil fuels. Nafi, Vivian said, one of the messages that you said, Nafi, was that Africa cannot phase out when it has not phased in. This is something that African leaders, when they arrived in Belém, they had this. They asked for room for fossil fuels in the transition. What are your thoughts on how this sort of narrative could impinge the continent's transition and for the proposed roadmap? What timelines do you suggest should be set for the transition that would be suited for Africa to get on par?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think that it's important to recognize that the continent is at different stages, and that reality needs to be factored into planning processes. When Africans talk about we cannot phase out when we haven't phased in, it is really about confronting and understanding the reality that the continent faces. With the statistic that I shared about the number of Africans who live without electricity, and we need electricity to actually power development on the continent to provide employment and decent jobs. We need support, we need technical knowledge. When many of my colleagues spoke about knowledge sharing, this is really about it, how we support the continent to embrace this new era and be able to have dignified life. And so what the continent is really, and I don't think that it's sending a mixed signal about a phase out. It's really about confronting and embracing the reality on the ground that we need finance. Bottom line, finance. We have the COPs have never fulfilled on its promises on finance, and we need that to be able to do. We just heard that developed countries are actually, whilst some of them are investing in oil sector, they are still investing in renewables. because they have the capacity and the finances to do that. Africa doesn't have that, and that's a reality that we need to put on the table. And so I'm not going to sit here and say this is the timeline for Africa to, let's have the conversation as partners, all right? Deal with African leaders as partners, as equal decision makers at the table, understanding each African country's context. Africa it's made up of different countries with different realities, all right? Some depend on fossil fuel like Nigeria. Switching off the tap means you're going to, stop development for how many millions of people living in Nigeria? Over 80% of the revenue comes from the oil sector. What are we talking about? Let's have a decent conversation. Let's have a constructive conversation with African leaders where we are designing package and plans that suits their ability, their capacity to be able to phase out in a just, dignified, equitable manner. That's what we are talking about. And so Belém should provide a space when we are agreeing on a collective roadmap that can allow all countries to move in a manner that doesn't leave any country behind.
Thank you so much, everybody. We're at time. If you would like to ask a question, we can do that outside of the press briefing. Is that okay?
Yeah,
Thank you so much, everybody. Really happy that you could join us today. We'll answer all of the questions that we received online in due course.